good evening, and welcome to another video. Today you're gonna learn one of the most famous as well as useful chess quotes. But first we're gonna play through a game that perfectly illustrates this famous chess quote. The game is 65 years old and between Bobby Fischer with the white pieces and Katja with the black pieces. But before we begin the game, I should come with a warning though. I will, in this video, in this game, I will try to trick you in the exact same manner as Bobby Fischer tricked his opponent 65 years ago. But if you keep your eyes open and your mind sharp, then you might avoid falling for my trap, but I think it's going to be difficult. Let's play through the game. We're in the city Mar del Plata in Argentina, and Bobby Fischer had the white pieces. He played this move e4, and maybe this reminds you of maybe his most famous quote, e4 best by test. This is, however, not the subject of today's video, though of course I thought it was worth mentioning now that he did play e4. His opponent went for c5, the Sicilian defense, and Bobby Fischer played knight f3, then came d6 and d4. This is what we call the open Sicilian. Black captures on d4, and Bobby captured back with the knight. Then came knight f6, attacking this pawn on e4, and Bobby Fischer protected this pawn by going with knight c3. Here black has a few different options, one of them being the classical variation with knight c6. Of course, there's a very interesting dragon variation with pawn to g6. But in this game, his opponent put his pawn on a6 instead. And this is what we call the knight-off defense, looking to go b5 at one point. Bobby Fischer now put his bishop on c4. This is a very good diagonal for the bishop to be in, adding pressure on f7, and his opponent didn't really care for that, so he put his pawn on e6, kind of blocking this diagonal. This is nothing new so far. It had been played many times before and thousands of times since then. And Bobby Fischer, of course, knew the theory, which is bishop b3. This is because black is going to play b5 at one point or another, and once he does that, it's nice that it doesn't come with a tempo on this bishop. So bishop back to b3, and black actually played this immediately. Bobby Fischer now castled kingside, and his opponent put his bishop on b7. This comes with an attack on the e4 pawn, and white can choose to protect this, maybe by going rook e1. But Bobby Fischer here, he kind of provoked his opponent a little bit by not protecting this pawn and instead going f4. Very aggressive looking move. Now, why can't black just capture here on e4? Well, the thing is, he can do that, but it's a very brave decision because the king here on e8 is still uncastled, and white could now try to further open up the position by going f5. Black really shouldn't capture here, as white would be able to capture back, and it would open both for the bishop and the rook on f1. He might try something like e5 in this position to try to keep things closed in the center, But then white would be able to play something like queen h5, threatening checkmate in one move on f7. And though black could of course defend this with a move like queen d7, it's really a very uncomfortable position for black to be in. White could now put maybe the knight, maybe the bishop on e6, taking advantage of this pawn being pinned by the queen. And it's really, this is not something you want against the strongest player in the world at this point. He's in for a very hard time, this king, and might never get the time to castle. So black didn't dare to go for this line, which I think is completely understandable. So if we go back a little bit to this position where Bobby Fischer played f4, he decided to just keep developing instead, going knight c6. But Bobby Fischer now, he still wanted to ask about this king in the middle of the board, and he did so by playing f5. Black really shouldn't capture here as it would open up the e-file, so instead he played the very understandable e5, closing things instead. But Bobby Fischer, he actually wanted to see this move. He had something very specific in mind by provoking this pawn move. So let's see what he had spotted. He had spotted a weakness here. And maybe you don't spot the weakness in black's camp immediately, but I promise that in just a few moves it's going to become very clear what weakness I am talking about. First he captured here. The knight is of course under attack, so he traded this for black's knight. Black captured back. Now he decided to protect this pawn on e4 with the queen move, queen d3. This is, of course, a little bit of a defensive move, but it's also getting ready to develop this bishop and get the connection between the hooks. His opponent put the bishop on e7, and I completely understand this move. I think that he's just trying to get time to castle kingside before white has time to initiate an attack. But Bobby Fischer wasn't necessarily looking for a chaotic attack with lots of sacrifices in this game. He was looking for more of a positional advantage. He now played the move bishop g5. And you might ask yourself, does Bobby Fischer really want to trade his bishop for the knight? Aren't these world champions and grandmasters supposed to like the bishop a little bit more? Well, in some positions they do, and in some positions they don't. This time in this game, Bobby Fischer is evaluating this based on this certain weakness that I keep talking about. So he might be ready to capture this if it means that he can exploit a certain weakness better. Black played queen to b6. This comes with a check on the white king, and white has a few different ways to respond. He could of course go queen e3, trading off the queens maybe, but then that would, if white went here and black captured, then this bishop would have to go back, and it went here for a very specific reason. This is also why he didn't want to put it back, even though it would come with an attack on the black queen. So instead he simply put his king in the safe corner on h1. Okay, black now castled, and of course it's not enough to just say castle, because he could also castle queenside, but I think that looks a little bit dubious. He castled kingside instead, and I imagine that he was quite relieved at this point. He's playing against the great Bobby Fischer, and he has managed to do pretty fine so far. He managed to castle, he got out both of his bishops and his knight, and it looks like black might be doing okay. But this is actually not the case, because Bobby Fischer now captured on f6. This is a very important positional trade that he's making. He captured here and black captured back. I once mentioned that capturing with the pawn really isn't worth considering, as it leaves the king very open. This d-file could become very deadly. White might even make a rook lift. So instead he captured with the bishop. Okay. Now if we look at the position, we can see that there is a weakness on d6. And white could actually capture this immediately if he wanted to. So Bobby could play something like this. It would win a pawn, so it probably wouldn't be so bad. But then again, this does open up the position a little bit for black's bishop pair, and black could immediately gain control in the d-file by putting either one of these rooks on d8. Then the queen would have to move, and maybe black could get a rook to the second rank, and it's not so clear if this is really that much better for white. But there's another weakness that has to do with d6, but isn't quite d6. It is d5. d5 is also weak, and d5 has been weak ever since black was maybe not forced, but black was provoked to push the pawn to e5, because d5 can no longer be protected by a black pawn, and there is no longer a knight on f6 that can protect this square. And when Bobby Fischer now played bishop d5, he is trading off the last minor piece black has that would be able to control this square. Notice that black can't really avoid this trade. If the bishop drops back, then the rook on a8 is hanging. And if he captures on d5, of course the knight would be able to recapture. So instead he tried to get out of this pin, but he wasn't quite in time, because now Bobby captured on d5. Black captured back with the rook. And here maybe knight d5 could be played immediately, but he decided to prepare it first by putting the rook here on the semi-open d-file. His opponent decided to double the rooks in the c-file. This is normally quite a good plan when playing the Sicilian defense, but this time it's not enough, because once this knight lands on d5, white really does have the positional advantage. It comes of course with an attack on the black queen, which moved back to g8. And let's prepare these two pieces for a moment. The knight on d5 is on an outpost. It's on a square that is protected by a white pawn, but not attacked by any black pawns. It is on a semi-open file, so the queen and the rook, they can get some activity behind the knight. And if we look at this bishop, well, it's kind of blocked in behind these two black pawns and dark squares. It could go here, but it's not really doing anything. So this knight is by far the superior piece. And once black moved his queen to d8, I must ask you anyway, do you think we should capture on f6 after everything that I just said? No, of course not. The great Bobby Fischer wouldn't dream of giving up such as superior knight for such a bad bishop, and he instead pushed this pawn to c3, which is kind of making these rooks on c6 and c8 look a little bit ridiculous because they're now eyeing the c3 square, the c3 pawn, but it is protected by the pawn, the queen, and the knight, so it's really not realistic that black can ever use the pressure in the c file for anything. So instead, he put his bishop back to e7. And I have to ask you again, do you think we should capture this bishop? Should we make this trade on e7? Because if we don't, black might retreat with the bishop and go to f8. So what do you think? Should we capture on e6? e7? No. Of course, still this knight is much better than the bishop, and even if black put their bishop on f8, it wouldn't accomplish anything, and probably white would even be able to push the pawns to f6. So certainly we want to keep this knight on d5. Bobby Fischer instead played the move rook to a1. And now this move does deserve a little bit of an explanation. Because why would the rook leave the semi-open file to go here and stand behind a pawn? Well, Bobby of course doesn't intend to leave this pawn on a2. Instead, he wants to push it to a4 to open up the a file for the rook. Imagine that this rook could come down to the 7th rank or 7th heaven. It would attack here, suddenly make the bishop on e7 look very vulnerable. So this is the idea behind rook a1, to push a4 and open up another file for the rook. His opponent now put his pawn on f6, and well, once again I will ask you, do you think we should capture on e7? Yes or no? If I hear you say no, you are of course correct. There is no reason to give up this beautiful knight, especially now that black has put their pawn on f6. We see that the bishop is even worse than before, and it only has these two squares to move on. So Bobby Fischer instead continued with his plan on opening up here in the a file, and if black were to capture here, it would probably lose a pawn, as Bobby would capture back, attacking this pawn twice, and it's really very difficult for black to not lose this, as the other rook could also go to a1 to further increase the pressure. So after a4, instead of capturing, black put his rook on b8 in order to protect on b5. And I will ask you again, do you think we should trade this knight on d5 for the bishop on e7? If you once again said, no way, I'm trading my good knight for the bad bishop, then I am sorry to tell you that you did fall into my trap, just like Bobby Fischer's opponent did in this game. Because the position just changed after black's last move. Once this rook went from c8 to b8, Bobby Fischer, I imagine that he heard an inner voice tell him, the position is now tactical. There's an undefended rook on c6 that wasn't there before. And now capturing here on e7 is the absolute best move. Black, of course, has to capture back. Otherwise, they just lost a bishop, and they will also lose this rook. But after the queen captures, we see why this rook being undefended is a huge problem. Queen d5. Giving check to the black king and then picking up this rook in the next move. And although of course white had such a nice position with the good knight versus the bad bishop, being up a full rook after, let's say, something like this is of course still much better. So his opponent actually resigned as soon as he captured on e7. And this leads us back to the quote that I promised to share with you. And this chess quote is as simple as it is true. The quote goes, "Tactics flow from a superior position." And I think that this game illustrated it so nicely. Sometimes we tend to force the tactics and try to play for an attack straight out of the opening, but we should focus on getting a good position first, making sure that our pieces are happy, that we have developed all of our pieces and castled and made the trades that we wanted to. And then once you have a good position, suddenly the tactics, they will just fall right into your hands, exactly as it did to Bobby Fischer in this game. And if you're wondering who said this quote, it is of course Bobby Fischer. I hope you enjoyed this game, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.